song we sang, Pierce My Ear, I'm going to ask you to turn to Exodus chapter 21. And I'm going to explain that very briefly, because I realized through some conversations that not everybody understands what in the world the songwriter was talking about. Am I too loud? Okay. Exodus 21:1. Now these are the ordinances which you are to set before them. This is God speaking to Moses. If you buy a Hebrew slave, he shall serve for 6 years. But on the 7th he shall go out as a free man without payment. If he comes along, he shall go out. If he comes alone, he shall go out alone. And if he is the husband of a wife, then his wife shall go out with him. If his master gives him a wife, and she bears him sons or daughters, the wife and her children shall belong to her master, and he shall go out alone. But if the servant plainly says, quote, I love my master, my wife, and my children, I will not go out as a free man, unquote. Then his master shall bring him to God. Then he shall bring him to the door or the doorpost, and the master shall pierce his ear with an awl, and he shall serve him permanently. That's the background of the song. A slave willingly decides that he does not want to be released. He loves his situation, he loves his master, and if he decides that he wants to stay, then that's how it's done. And he is legally bound during that time, under that law, to then stay, he and his family, with his master forever. And the point of that song is we're asking God to take us to his door and pierce our ears to the door, and thus we are committing by that act, in the Old Testament sense, to be the Lord's servant forever. Any questions or comments about that? Okay.
Thanks for explaining.
Oh, you're welcome. You're welcome. I didn't realize that people didn't have that right on the top of their list of things that they had right in front of their lines. Okay, one other thing. After we go through Ezra, which is only, I believe, 10 chapters, and Nehemiah, we're going to be at a place where I need some input from you folks as to what you want to do next. Billy is staying back there. I thought he was coming back in here. I was mistaken. So I need some suggestions as to where we're going to be in about 3 weeks. You don't need to tell me tonight unless you've got some ideas. I'd love to hear them. Any subject or any, minor prophets? That's a suggestion. I did those here many years ago. My goodness, it's been a while. Well, that's one suggestion. Any others? Let me know. I tell you what, at my age, you better hand me a piece of paper. All right. Okay. The year is 458 BC. Ezra has just returned with a group of people from captivity. Ezra chapter 9, verse 1. Remember, we picked up Ezra in chapter 7, which is mostly taken up with the fact that Ezra, in the first 10 verses, it's a capsule of his return. And then the rest of the chapter is the decree that Artaxerxes issued, permitting Ezra and the rest of the exiles to come back, and the details concerning that. Chapter 8 begins with a list of those who returned with Ezra, or at least a list of the heads of families. And then he looks around and realizes that, hey, we don't have enough Levites with us to make temple service manageable. And so he recruits some Levites, priests and Levites, and then we have his arrival in Jerusalem. He delivers the gold and silver and all the other treasures which had been committed to him at the beginning of the trip. He takes those and turns them over to the proper authorities at the temple in Jerusalem upon his arrival. And then he delivers, I believe it's the last verse of that chapter, he delivers the king's edict or commission, which Artaxerxes had given him, and gives a copy to all of the surrounding officials so that they won't have any questions about, what are you doing here? Are you authorized to do what you are doing? And he wants to make sure that everybody around, all the other governors surrounding Judah, are aware of what he is doing concerning his return with the captives. And that brings us to Ezra chapter 9 and verse 1, where we find out that things are not all rosy and peachy in Judah when he gets back, and we find out in the first couple of verses that there is a great need of revival among God's people. Let me see, let me get on that page here. Ezra got a report that the Jewish people, who were called a holy people, had begun to do what? Intermarry and mix with the surrounding populations. And had this happened before? When they first went into the land. It's what got them kicked out of the land in the first place, was their communication and intermarriage with the surrounding populations. And this fact was reported to Ezra by a group of leaders about the worldly sinful behavior, that they weren't living lives of holiness, if you prefer, or lives of separation from the people around them. And they were divorcing their own wives, apparently Malachi 2:16, and marrying with the ungodly people around them. By the way, Malachi is active about this time, or close to this time. Now you've got to observe that these marriages were not like the marriages of Ruth and Rahab, because what did they do? What kind of people were they? They converted to Judaism and were godly women. Okay? But there was no conversions involved in these intermarriages with the people around them. These other marriages, these marriages that Ezra's facing, resulted in the Jews who had come home, leaving the faith and turning against God and living a life of sin. And Ezra in verse 3 was extremely upset when he got the report of what was going on, and was joined by others. And verses 5 through 15 is a beautiful prayer of confession of what the people of Judah had done. In verses 6 and 7, he confesses their shame and their past sins, and how high had they piled up? Higher up to the heavens. That's how great Ezra considered the sin of the people that he had just found out. But let me tell you, don't get too sad about it, because look at Psalms 108 verse 4. For your loving kindness is great above the heavens. Wherever sin has reached, God's love goes further. And there's a beautiful song to that effect. What is it? His grace reaches me? Yeah. And verse 7 tells us that sadly this situation was nothing new. In verses 8 and 9, he confessed that God had been very, very good to them, in spite of the fact that he called them extremely stubborn all the way through the Exodus up until the time they went into the land, and even thereafter. Verses 10 through 12, he confessed their present sins, that they had copied their pagan neighbors and even intermarried with them. In verses 13 through 15, he confessed that they were unworthy of God's goodness that he had just celebrated. He acknowledged that God had punished them less than they deserved. And that they were, in verse 14, repeating what they had done in the past. Notice the word again there. And that they fully, in verse 15, deserved God's judgment for everything that they had done. And that's a good pattern for a prayer for us. And there's not a single person here that can't utter that prayer with those feelings, because our sins are stacked, I suppose, just as high as theirs were. Any questions on Ezra 9?
Lloyd?
Yes, Edward?
God was looking forward to the perfect law of liberty. It was one reason that he would be lenient with them.
That he would be what with them?
That he would be lenient with them and not as harsh on them, because the perfect law of liberty, they couldn't keep the law that they had. That was impossible. And they did even past the impossible. But I think this is just a suggestion that God was looking forward to the law that he was going to give them through Christ.
Okay. Okay. Any other comments on Ezra 9? We zip through there quickly. All right, Ezra chapter 10. After this disaster, and it was an unmitigated disaster that Ezra found himself facing when he got back, we're going to have a revival. Ezra chapter 10. Because Ezra's prayer of confession did produce, at least temporarily, the desired result that he wanted. And many gathered to him and confessed their sins along with Ezra. They joined him in weeping over their sins. And in verses 3 through 5, a man named Shechaniah arose and stepped in as leader of the people. He acknowledged their sin and their unfaithfulness, but he declared, thankfully, that there was yet hope for God's people. And he suggested that they repent, promise God that they're going to divorce their unbelieving, ungodly, pagan wives or husbands and send them away. And here's what is so sad. What's the 3 words I'm looking at? With their children. With their children. So they go out of the house also. In verse 3, he says it's going to be done according to the law. I take that to mean Deuteronomy 24, 1 through 2, which is God's decree or law through Moses of how to give your mate, a wife, a bill of divorcement and to send her away. Now, and so in verse 4, Shechaniah told him, listen, don't just cry over all of this. We need to get up and do something about this awful situation that we find ourselves in, and it's our own fault. Well, Ezra arises in verse 5 and takes some decisive action. He led the people to swear an oath, and this is common throughout Ezra and Nehemiah. After he gets a promise, he wants an oath that they are going to follow through and do what they had suggested or promised that they were going to do. And so in verse 7, he calls a general assembly in Jerusalem, and he tells them, by the way, if you don't show up within 3 days, you're going to lose all of your property, and we're going to excommunicate you from the Jewish family here in Judah. So he meant business. He does, and so does his successor, by the way. Make a note of that, Nehemiah. When he says something, you better pay close attention. So, with that threat, the people did indeed assemble within 3 days, and this was in, I think, December of 458 BC, in the square right in front of the temple. It included everybody, even all the Israelites, as we learn from verse 25. Ezra told them in verses 10 and 11 that they had sinned by marrying these ungodly people, that they must confess their sin and separate from the godless people around them and divorce their pagan wives. The people agreed to what Ezra said down in verse 12. And now, what's the weather doing? It is the rainy season, and it is pouring down rain as they are standing out there in front of the temple area in the open in the pouring down rain. And basically they said, it's time for us to go home. It's time to break this meeting up. We've got too many people here now to settle this about who's going to divorce who and who needs to divorce who. And there were too many people involved, so they suggested that local officials of each town in verse 14 act on behalf of the people that they were serving, to handle each case by an appointment and to investigate and fully identify or correctly identify the people who are guilty. You don't want to make anything subject of guesswork or rumor. You want to check each situation individually out to make sure that this drastic step of separating a family is done correctly. Okay. And verse 15, the people accepted the suggestion. And verse 17 tells us that the People's Association and marriages were then investigated for the next 3 months. And we'll leave that and pick that up. It just drops it. I think we'll pick it up a little bit later. But anyway, verses 18 through 44 is simply a list that was made during those 3 months of those who had been found to be offenders, that is, the guilty, list of the guilty, who had to break the marriages up and send those idolatrous mates out of the house and back home. Now, did Ezra's ministry here and his efforts and his weeping and his praying and his cajoling and his threats end this problem? No. Don't get too excited about it, because when Nehemiah comes back 13 years later, he's going to encounter the same problem. Now, as far as what happens to the families that were sent off, the wives and the children, I am sure that some sort of provision was made for them according to the circumstances and the means of the husbands involved. And if they couldn't pay it or make sure that they were taken care of, that other means were done to take care of those who were put away. And with that, the book of Ezra comes to an abrupt end. Now, don't bemoan the fact that we leave Ezra here, because during the book of Nehemiah, 13 years later, we will find Ezra and Nehemiah together later. Any questions on the book of Ezra? This is which return? It's the second return. The first one was under Zerubbabel, 538. This is the second one, 458. And under Nehemiah, we're going to have the third and final biblical return from exile. Any questions on Ezra?
I have a question.
Yeah, comment? Yeah,
That just seems so hard.
it is harsh.
And of course, they shouldn't have done it to begin with.
What happened when they didn't separate from their idolatrous mates the first time? Yeah, yes, they did. The cancer spread all the way through, almost infected almost the entire nation of Israel years
This
ago.
happened under Ishmael and Hagar. Hagar and Ishmael were sent away from Israel just as these people were.
Yeah, but for a little bit different reasons, but yes, they were sent away.
That
Yeah.
was the first time it had happened.
Yeah. Now, by today's standard, this would be unthinkable to ask people to do this. But that's how serious the threat was to God's people. And the law of Moses was intended to be a hedge, a wall around his people to keep them separate, or what's another better good word for separate? Holy. Okay? Wanted his people to be holy, and intermarrying with the surrounding nations was a guarantee that that was not going to happen. It was not going to happen. So, yes, it's very strict, very, in our minds, probably harsh, but it was the right thing to do. Okay, let's move to the book of Nehemiah. If we don't have any more comments.
I may
Yes,
just
sir.
on that real quick. The whole history that we've been studying this whole time has been because they originally did do what God said when they went into the promised land. These people wouldn't have been there if they'd done the letter of the law as God intended for them to do it. it's the reason why, because of this influence that remained. That's why they're being gone in captivities all over the world. And now they finally got a remnant of them coming back. And it's kind of like we got a fresh start. So
It is.
here, this has been our problem from the time we entered into the promised land. And we get ready to resettle this promised land again. We got to cut it out. So I mean, there's hundreds of years of history of this problem.
Yes.
And he's got an opportunity, and I think he's well within his rights. And that's what God intended for
Yes.
us to do.
Well, the nation had been reduced to a remnant, as you use that word, which is a small amount which was left. And now the remnant was being contaminated with this problem. And that, if that happened without Ezra and Nehemiah's efforts, I don't see how God could have carried out his plan.
There's 10 tribes that are completely assimilated.
They're gone.
They can't even trace their ancestry back anymore. It's impossible. They're so intermarried.
Because of their, yes,
They're gone.
yeah. And so I guess, Ann, that makes it clear that even though that is harsh, and if you look at the list of offenders, I didn't total it up, but I, well, it is, I did. It's about 120 people, 120 families out of 40,000. Okay, so it wasn't, but it was presented as a disaster. And why? With that small amount. As you, many of you know, when you get cancer, it starts out small, but it can spread very fast and become very, very deadly.
Lloyd, was it 40,000 in the second return? Did you say it was 40,000?
No, I said there was probably about 40,000 people living in Judah at the time.
How many was in the second return? You know, I don't.
What was it, 5,000, 4,800? 4,800, I think, Ed. The first one was a lot larger under Zerubbabel. It was about 49,000, wasn't it?
That's right.
Okay, 13 years later, under the reign of the same Persian king, I'll try to keep my kings straight tonight, Artaxerxes, who is not Esther's husband. It was Xerxes who was Esther's husband, his predecessor. And we're going to read about Nehemiah's first administration, because I think it's fairly obvious that he had 2 terms as governor, if you please, in Judah. Okay, Nehemiah hears the news, the bad news of the situation 13 years after we left Ezra. 13 years later, we're in about 445 BC now. And Nehemiah is in Susa, the same place where all of the book of Esther took place, where the king lives. In December, it was the same palace that Esther became queen in. And there Nehemiah gets a visit from his brother and some others who come to him from the exiles from Judah, and they brought some very dismal news to Nehemiah about the situation back in Judah and Jerusalem. The returned exiles and the Jews who had survived the captivity, that is, those who had never been deported in the first place, is how I understand that. That's verse 3. That had been left behind were in distress, trouble, and great shame and disgrace because of the situation there. Jerusalem was in a shambles yet, and the walls were still in terrible shape. Remember that the walls had been destroyed by Nebuchadnezzar about 141 years ago in 586 BC. And there had been some efforts to fix that problem, but the efforts had been stopped, and so the walls were still sitting there in a terrible state, and the gates were gone too, by the way. You remember back in Ezra 4:12, Ezra chapter 4 and verse 12, the people had been rebuilding those walls, but were stopped by this Artaxerxes. And the letter is in Ezra 4, and that was verses 6 through 23, when they reported back what was going on, and Artaxerxes, make sure this work stops until we can check the records. And I'll let you know later what my final decision is, but the work stopped right then and there. That's in Ezra 4. 4 verse 21 says, So now issue a decree to make these men stop the work, that this city may not be rebuilt until, Ezra 4:21, until a decree is issued by me. So, the walls are still in the same situation as we find them under in the first chapter of Nehemiah. And when Nehemiah, who was serving in Artaxerxes' royal court, found out what was happening in the situation back with the homeland, he was brokenhearted. He wept, mourned, and fasted and prayed for many days. Verses 5 through 11 is Nehemiah's prayer. Reminds me a lot of Ezra's. He acknowledged God. And I love verse 6 and 7. He identified with these people by confessing their sins, all of them. He became an intercessor for his people and begged for God's mercy in verses 8 through 11 by asking God to remember their relationship in verse 8 and begged God to hear his prayer in verse 11. Now, he also realized that he did not have a leg to stand on as he approached God about this problem. Because whose fault was it? It was their own fault. Again, it was their own fault. He asked God to remember their relationship, and lastly, he asked the Lord to make an opportunity for him to approach King Artaxerxes with this problem. And then he tells us, oh, by the way, I was the cupbearer to the king. Now, cupbearer spent a lot of time with the king, probably had the king's ear whenever he wanted it. He was obviously a man of great trust because it was his job that when the food, especially the wine, was brought in for the king to eat and drink, he tested it first to make sure that it had not been poisoned. Now, remember when we went through the kings of Israel, the northern kingdom, how many assassinations there were? The Persian court was known for the same type of behavior. Same thing. It was a dangerous position to be king in Persia. And Nehemiah was wanting to ask Artaxerxes to reverse his previous proclamation where he had stopped the walls from being built. Apparently, the until I say so, they cannot go ahead, had not been done. So, the walls were still standing there in a disastrous or very bad situation. It is 8 o'clock. Any questions?
He rode his horse around, donkey around in there.
That's what he's fixing to do next. Yeah. Now, please let me know what you folks want to do next. If you don't, you know who's going to make the decision. Like it or not. What? Let me know what you want to do. If I don't hear anything, I assume you don't care. Any final comments? Let's pray. Lord, dismiss us tonight in your love, and help us to remember that we are all indeed sinners in need of your mercy, and that we have no right to stand for you except for the blood of Christ who died so that we could have this avenue of prayer. And help us to always lead a life of prayer and appreciation for what you've done. In Jesus' name, amen.